Welcome into the fantasy draft room. I am Cody Smith at Cody Smith TFDR, and today we are talking about the top 10 early wide receiver rankings that I have for the 2024 rookie class that are going to be backfilling the spots in the NFL this coming draft season. We just got done with the Senior Bowl, and we are going to be diving straight into all of these guys who they were not at the Senior Bowl. For most of these guys, a couple of them will be, but at the very top, we are going to go one down to the bottom of the 10th overall player that I have, because at the top, you know who it is. It is the guy who has been at the top for the entirety of the last 2 years. Marvin Harrison Jr., the guy who is the son of the former Hall of Fame wide receiver in the NFL, who has produced at Ohio State the last 2 years, producing over 1,200 yard, 14 touchdown, back-to-back seasons. It is unquestioned in my mind who the number one overall wide receiver is in the 2024 wide receiver class. It is Marvin Harrison Jr. If you want to look at his game, honestly, you don't even need to. But if you want to look at the takeaways from his game, he is a 6'3", 202-pound, 85 targets, 67 reception, 1,200-yard wide receiver, like I said, and he possesses all of the traits and abilities to be a number one overall Jamar Chase-esque type of a player. As soon as he steps into a team, he will be a guaranteed top 5, in my opinion, locked and loaded, either going to the Arizona Cardinals or potentially the Los Angeles Chargers as well. Draft in the NFL draft. There is no if, ands, or buts about it. Marvin Harrison Jr. should be the number one overall wide receiver in your drafts, and potentially even in Superflex drafts, be the number one overall wide receiver or the number one player taken off the board. Coming in at number 2 is Malik Neighbors, the junior wide receiver out of LSU. Continuing along the bloodlines of the LSU wide receivers, Malik Neighbors comes in as a guy who we thought was going to potentially be playing behind Kayshon Boutte, the guy who failed at the New England Patriots this last year, slotting in as like a 6th, 7th round draft pick and really never showing anything on the field because he was overplayed and taken over by Malik Neighbors his sophomore year whenever he was at LSU. Come to his senior, and now he has Jaden Daniels and an explosive offense where he is one of the most prolific players in all of college football in 2023. Malik Neighbors, honestly, in any other class that didn't have Marvin Harrison Jr. that we just discussed, would be the number one overall wide receiver. He's unfortunately not here, but he is definitely not a down tier from Marvin Harrison Jr., even though he is a fantastic prospect. Malik Neighbors is right up there alongside of him, a guy who can run the route tree like nobody other. He accelerates through his breaks. He gets so much separation just being a route runner, and he has a yak ability to comparatively coincide along with it. One of the best prospects that we're going to see in this class. He should be a top 6 rookie pick in any format of dynasty leagues this upcoming year. Back-to-back 1,000+ yardage season years. This season going for 1,569 yards. Again, 14 touchdowns. I mean, basically looks about statistically wise right alongside of Marvin Harrison Jr. The only thing is, whenever you look at Malik Neighbors, 6'1", 188, the size profile along with the speed profile isn't really there. Now, I do think that if Malik Neighbors was 6'3", 202, 205, like Marvin Harrison Jr. was, and he didn't have the name cachet of a former first ballot, I don't know if he was first ballot, but Hall of Fame wide receiver in his father, I do think that we'd be having a much different conversation. And I think even for an NFL scheme fit, the NFL could be having a much different conversation about who they believe is the wide receiver one in this class. I still believe it's Marvin Harrison Jr., but Malik Neighbors, not a bad second choice. Coming in at wide receiver number 3 overall off the board is wide receiver out of Washington, Rome Odunn. This was one of the best offenses in college football last year, alongside of Michael Penix and a lot of other receiving weapons that they did have in Washington. Rome Odunn was the one who stood out. Alongside of that, he has that prototypical size, right? He is that Marvin Harrison type, 6'3", 200 pounds. He is one of these guys that is going to go out there and use his body at the next level to shield off defenders, and he's going to be a contested catch absolute threat. The only thing that I don't have about him that I do kind of put him down into that secondary tier for me is I don't think he's much of a positive after the catch. He's still very good there, but he's nothing like the Malik Neighbors, like the Marvin Harrison Jr.'s that we were just talking about. in those first two rankings. And so he does take down a little bit. I do think there's a little bit of a separation of a tier for me outside of the 1 and 2 to get down to Rome Odunn, but it is not that far off. He still has one of the best deep ball tracking abilities in this class with an absolute fantastic high point catch availability. He has enough speed to separate in the short spaces of the field as well. So he is not just a true down the field vertical stretch deep threat. He can win at every single level. I think that he is one of the best wide receivers in this class, obviously putting him here at the number 3 overall pick. And I do think that he has a potential to be a top 10 wide receiver pick in the actual NFL draft, as well as he should be a top 7 pick, I think, in every fantasy dynasty draft coming up in this season. One of the best wide receiver prospects that you could potentially get your hands on in the 2024 class. At wide receiver 4, I think this is where we really start to have a conversation. Some people might have a different wide receiver 3. They might have a different ordering between Marvin Harrison Jr., between Malik Neighbors and Rome Odunn, but I'm pretty sure most people have those guys within their top 3. Wide receiver 4 is where I think it gets really interesting, and it's where we get to one of my favorite players in the draft, wide receiver Troy Franklin out of Oregon. He had a fantastic senior year whenever Bo Nix came in and transferred in with him. 81 catches, 1,300 yards, and 14 touchdowns as well. All of these guys ended up somehow with 14 touchdowns on the year. Now, Troy Franklin is not the perfect prospect like we've seen with a lot of other guys that we were talking about at the top 3. Fly buzzing in my face, but it's not going to stop us. And it's not going to stop Troy Franklin either, even though he is a little bit of a lighter frame. 6'2", 170 pounds is definitely slender, almost kind of like a taller version of a Slim Reaper is kind of what I give his comp to in the NFL. The only thing is he's not as technically defined route running. He is definitely a straight line burner. If you ask him to make all of these technically defined in routes, out routes, if you ask him to stop and accelerate, it's not really his game. But whenever you put him on a straight line, whether that's on a crosser, whether it's on a bend route, whether that is just straight down the field, he is one of the best players in this class. And I actually think he is the best player at doing that in this class. Now, obviously, whenever you start getting down into these players, there is a little bit of there's going to be warts that show up in their profile. We watched 2 games over in the Destination Devy Discord of Bucky Irving, and while we were watching it, we were also watching some Troy Franklin. He does have a little bit of a drop problem. There's some concentration drops that you would not like to see with a wide receiver that you're going to be taking 4th overall, although I still think he is worthy of that spot. He does need to build the separation through his speed. He's not really strong after the catch point either, but he can make the first man miss. He's just not really laterally gifted. He's not going to have that quick area agility. I don't think personally that's going to allow him to be an absolute yak monster unless he is on that straight line, just continuing the route as he's catching the ball in stride. But when he has that ability, like we're seeing here, 17.1 yards per catch, if he does get that ball caught in stride, he has the ability every single time to take it all the way to the house. One of my favorite wide receivers in the class. I'm sure we'll talk a lot more on shows whenever Chase is back about Troy Franklin because I know he likes him too. Now we get into a range that I'm really not as comfortable with, but a lot of people are very comfortable with this guy, and it is the second LSU wide receiver who, at the original time whenever they were brought into the program, Brian Thomas was supposed to be the number 1 for this offense, even over Kayshawn, even over Malik Neighbors, who has now surpassed him. But Brian Thomas was a highly touted prospect whenever he was coming into LSU. It didn't really turn out that way, that he was the number 1 guy, but don't take that the wrong way. He's still a very good wide receiver. I just think he's a little bit more limited than a guy like Malik Neighbors is, who has grown a lot more during his time in LSU. But the junior out of LSU, 6'5", 198, an absolute burner threat as well, like we just saw with Troy Franklin. But what Brian Thomas Jr. possesses that Troy Franklin doesn't exactly possess as much is that contested catch availability and that straight, deep, down the field target availability that Troy Franklin, he does possess it, but his contested catch just is not there. Brian Thomas Jr., possesses so much deep threat availability that the corners who are covering him at the collegiate level are so scared of him. And I think that's going to continue at the NFL level as well. Whenever he is running in a straight line as he's breaking off the line, that cornerback is almost immediately having to open up his hips, bail out, and then he can just turn it and catch a 5-yard out or a 5-yard curl every single time that he runs the route. He's completely wide open. And then it's just about Jaden Daniels actually hitting him. And if you want to go about the ones down the field, Jaden Daniels misses Brian Thomas on a lot of down the field balls, and he still catches 17 touchdowns in this offense for 1,200 yards, 17.3 a catch. The guy was just absolutely fantastic. Again, in one of the more prolific offenses in college that we saw this past season. However, he's still a very good wide receiver. Now, his best route in my mind that I honestly don't really like, and it's probably why I have him a little bit lower, but this is where he truly wins, is as a red zone threat. He runs that slot fade or that outside fade route better than anybody else in college football. I'm fairly sure probably 12 of those touchdowns 12 of 17 touchdowns that he has currently listed here are on that fade route. And he just high points the ball over the D-back every single time. Him and Jaden Daniels had perfected that route. Anytime they're inside the 20, you could bet Brian Thomas was going to get one, if not two shots at just that back corner of the end zone fade route. And he probably caught that ball 60 to 70% of the time, which is a absolute staggering number for a guy who's playing in that role. Brian Thomas Jr. is a very good wide receiver, but I do think he's a little bit more limited in the underneath and other areas of the field. I think he's a very good red zone threat, and I think he's a very good vertical threat, but I do think he has his limitations elsewhere, which is why I have him below Troy Franklin as my number 5 wide receiver. Getting into the second half of our top 10 wide receivers, the 6th wide receiver off the board is Adonai Mitchell out of Texas. Now, this is a wide receiver who we start to get to a point where I seriously have flaws within their game. And Adonai Mitchell is one of the most athletic profiles, actually, in my mind, outside of probably Marvin Harrison Jr. that we have in this class. 6'4", 190, can absolutely burn. He has the speed size comp that you would actually really like at this level. The only thing is it just doesn't always show up, and it's really hard to watch his film and say that he runs every single route like he should be doing. He looks like he dogs a lot of routes, which is a big red flag for me. Definitely something that can be fixed at the next level, but it's a thing that just, man, like you have to, he seems like whenever he's not getting the ball, there's just times where he doesn't really do anything, and it impacts his after the catch availability. It impacts a lot of things that he could be doing better. The yak score for him along with that is just going to end up being absolutely atrocious. There's more availability that I think we can see in the tape, but it just doesn't really show up as we see it right now. He does use his big size well, this 6'4" frame, very well on those contested catches. A lot of down the field contested catch wide receivers in this class that we really haven't seen a lot of times in the past couple of years of the wide receiver classes. We've been seeing a lot of these, the Jordan Addison types, the Devonta Smith types come out. We haven't really had these 6'2 plus 200-pound plus wide receivers. And I know, as you're seeing right now, Adonai Mitchell is only 190, but I do think he could eventually bulk up and might even bulk up into that once we get to the combine numbers over that 190 and well over that 190. One of the best physically gifted route runners in this class. However, I just don't see it come up all the time in his film. Now, there is that Quinn Ewers factor in here as well. Quinn Ewers, I still think, is a very good quarterback, but he's still at the collegiate level, doesn't play that consistently. And I do think that the hammers both of his wide receivers, one of which who we might see later in the next couple of picks. I'm sure you already know who that is. I want to look at some more tape on Adonai Mitchell. I want to go back to his 2022 year as well. But I do think he has the physical traits enough to get him here as my wide receiver 6 off the board. But I do still have things where I want to see more. I do think that once he gets into the NFL, it's going to be a lot on him. Can you take that jump? Can you take that next step to be a potential one in an offense? Because I do think he has that availability. I just don't always see it at the collegiate level, and that's why he falls here at 6. At number 7 is one of my favorite wide receivers in this class, and that is Georgia wide receiver Ladd McConkey. And now this is a guy who probably most of y'all probably haven't even really heard of before he got into this Senior Bowl, into this late in the window, actual type of hype season, but he has been an absolute riser. Day one of the Senior Bowl, it was like nobody there could stop him. He's an absolute riser from there, even though he did scale back his production in days 2 and 3 comparatively to all sources at the Senior Bowl. And in the actual Senior Bowl game, didn't really do much to impress, but nobody really did on the offensive side of the ball at the Senior Bowl. Very hard for those offensive players there, but where he did impress was during his time at Georgia. And even in those one-on-one routes at the Senior Bowl, he has one of the best route running availabilities of anybody in this class. One of our guys over at Destination Devi, Ray GQ, was down at the Senior Bowl day one, got an interview with Ladd McConkey, and was able to ask him what his comp, where he comped himself to in the NFL, who that player was, and his answer was a Cooper Kupp. And while you might think that's a little bit funny, obviously, because of the characteristics that he has, I don't really disagree with it, because you can't really comp him to an inside slot wide receiver, but I would definitely comp him to a Cooper Kupp who can play both in the slot, play outside. He can play at any level because he has an entire route tree perfectly combined. The availability in which he runs these routes, the suddenness, there's a violence in which he goes into each route, breaks at the point, and just creates yards of separation. And I absolutely love a good route runner who can win at any length of the field, no matter what the route is. Absolutely think that's Ladd McConkey, but there is some drawbacks, and that's why he comes in here at 7 and probably not 6, where I would really rather have him over Adonai Mitchell, who I still have concerns about, except for the physical profile. Ladd McConkey wins at the collegiate profile, and he wins there because he has this route running availability. I do have some concerns whenever he goes on to the next level that coverage might be a little bit tighter, and where we have seen Ladd not really have the success, I really haven't seen that much contested catch availability. Almost every time whenever he has a D-back draped over him, that ball is getting dropped. And I really need to see a lot more out of that area from Ladd McConkey to really say that this is going to be availability to step up into the next level. Now, if he can still create the separation, that's perfectly fine. You don't need to make the contested catches. Good by me, but that is a lot of scheme design, and that's a lot of him being able to transfer this prolific route running ability to the NFL level. And I don't know if that's going to happen. So he is a little bit lower here, but definitely one of my guys that I think is a guaranteed locked and loaded day 2 pick. I don't think just because of the physical attributes that he makes his way up into the first round, because he does lack an overall breakaway speed. He has the very good quickness and agility between short area routes that I really like. And that's what gets him to be available to break open these short and underneath routes, but I don't know if that's going to happen at the NFL level down the field like it happened at college. And he was dealing with some injuries during that time, out for a couple weeks with a back injury, and then again with an ankle injury. Maybe that takes down his stock a little bit as well in the NFL draft, but I do think that this is a really good day 2, day 3 wide receiver who can be an absolute amazing 2 if he falls into the right scheme at the NFL level. For the 8th overall wide receiver in the 2024 class, we do go back to the University of Texas, and we go back to Xavier Worthy. 6'1". The only thing here is 165. Really doesn't have that size built up on him yet that we really kind of like to see, but the NFL is changing, and we've seen guys like Devonte Smith, like Jordan Addison really excel at the NFL level because speed wins right now, and that is what Xavier Worthy has. He has probably the best speed out of any of the wide receivers in this class, maybe other than Troy Franklin, but Xavier Worthy does really possess that. The thing that separates and why he's so much further down the board for me than Troy Franklin is that I don't think he possesses that speed in every area. Troy Franklin, while I did say he lacks a little bit of the side-to-side horizontal agility that really lets him break away yak carries, in my mind, Xavier Worthy has none. He was used in the screen game so much in the games that I watched in this offense, almost never makes the first man miss in a screen game. And that's that should be a place where you really can excel at in the collegiate level. You should be able to make the first man miss almost every single time if you're worthy of being a first round pick in the NFL draft, and I almost never saw it from Xavier Worthy. Now, there is also a lot of times that he is missed down the field by Quinn Ewers, and I do think that this is a reason why his stats don't really look as great. You're seeing 121 targets, but only 75 catches for 1,100 yards and 5 touchdowns. Adonai Mitchell was obviously soaking up a lot of those touchdowns in the red zone, but Xavier Worthy had so many of these deep balls that he really could have been connected on, but I think he's a little bit limited to that role. He's really, in my mind, a vertical stretch down the field wide receiver, and that's not exactly the type that I really like to invest in dynasty fantasy football, because whenever you run that and your other route tree is a little bit limited, or at least you don't have the yak and the physical strength ability to win in the underneath and in the intermediate area, you end up turning into a guy who can really run the ball and can really go down the field and potentially make the catch sometimes, and you kind of turn into a Jameson Williams for me. And it's why I didn't really like JMO during the draft of whenever he was coming out 2 years ago. It's also why I don't really like Xavier Worthy here and why he's further down the board. But I do understand the physical ability that he does have. I do understand that he could find himself into a role where he's very well used. And I do think that the NFL teams will actually very highly value the speed that he does have. And that's why I think he's still a high day 2 pick or even a first round pick. If a team really does fall in love with him and he has a really good combine and everything, I think that path is still there, but he's always going to be lower down the board for me, because I do think that he's a little bit more of a one trick pony than a lot of the other guys that we're going to see here, or that we've already seen here in these top 7 picks. Next up in the ranks is another guy that I really like, but there are some obvious drawbacks, and that is Xavier Legette, senior wide receiver out of South Carolina, 6'1", 217 pounds. We're looking here at the profile, 97 targets, 71 receptions, 1,250 yards, and 7 touchdowns. He is an absolute big play machine at the college level. Now, there's going to be some questions about him, though, because he does win with just a brute physicality, and he almost looks like, I know everybody's going to compare the Malachi Corley almost to the Debo. I almost think that Xavier Legette could fit into that, but he did clock in at the Senior Bowl a little bit lighter than we found out, and he was even having some trouble separating at the Senior Bowl during the one-on-ones in practice, and so he does drop down a little bit in the rankings for me, but still a guy that I really like on tape, and one that I hope the NFL really likes as well, but a guy that I'm definitely more scared on. I'm still going to put him inside here at my number 9 overall wide receiver, but this is a guy that I do think could drop into that almost back of the day 2 into the day 3 draft capital in the NFL draft, and then you're probably not really looking at much of a actual upside profile that you would really want to draft here. But I do really like Xavier Legette for a couple of things, and the biggest thing is that big play, contested catch, high pointing the ball availability. I do really like Adonai Mitchell in it. I like Odunn in it. I like Marvin Harrison in it. But this guy creates some of the biggest catches that I have seen in the 2023 film that I have watched. He's one of the ones who just consistently makes big time catch after big time catch. He's always going to be fighting people for extra yards. Now, does that continue at the NFL level when all of these guys are a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger? You're not playing against non-Power 5 competition and running over people all the time. Does that exist? It probably won't exist as much, but I don't have any fear about this guy wanting to go and get it every single play. That once he has the ball in his hands, I do think that he is one of the best. I mean, he's coming in at probably a 75 percentile yards after the catch per reception guy. He's coming in at almost the 100th percentile of yards per route run. We have this tool over at the destinationdevy.com website where you have the spider graph that compares every one of the main comparison points in the rookie profile that you really want. And his profile is really good for somebody who's not inside of this top 6 wide receivers of the class. One of my really favorite wide receivers here. I don't have enough film to really get a true and complete profile on him yet. I want some more. There's a fear of him lacking a little bit of the short range agility to really be a true Debo Samuel guy, where he doesn't really have the availability to win underneath, doesn't have enough physicality to push the defenders off of him and to create that space. Still one of my favorite players, but I need to see a lot more. I think he could grow into the role, but there's a lot of prediction that I would have to have for Xavier Legette, and it's why he falls in here at the back of my top 10. But this is a stacked and loaded wide receiver class, and even being listed as wide receiver 10, wide receiver 15 isn't even a knock in this class. It's going to eventually be, because the NFL teams don't have enough room to draft all of them. But all of these guys are still very good. I do think that Xavier Legette's a good wide receiver, but he does fall down here at the wide receiver 9. Still inside the top 10, though, so pretty good. Last and finally, to round out my top 10 wide receivers of the 2024 rookie class is going to be wide receiver out of UNC, Devonte Walker, a junior, 6'1", 197 pounds. And unfortunately, I'm recording this video right after we just saw the Senior Bowl happen, and it was not a good week for Devonte Walker, or Tez Walker, as some people will call him, probably throughout the entirety of the draft class. It really wasn't good. There was a lot of drops. There was a lot of lack of separation. And that's a lot of what we saw at UNC. But what he does have is one of the best stories, honestly, in college football before we really get into his pros. We'll go through it really quickly. I'm sure most of y'all who are watching the show know already, but he started out at North Carolina Central during the COVID season, ended up never playing at North Carolina Central. So he goes and transfers to Kent State, leading wide receiver at Kent State 2 years in a row, absolutely dominated. Now, obviously not a high tier level profile college, but absolutely dominated there, and then goes and transfers to UNC, where he's going to be the number one wide receiver that everybody thought Drake May really needed and was going to propel UNC back into a little bit of contention. Even if they weren't going to be contending for a college football playoff, they were going to be a very good football team. And then the NCAA comes out and says, nah, because you transferred out of North Carolina Central to Kent State, you don't have a second transfer availability, even though he never played football. NCAA being on some BS rules, whatever, finally got solved, and he was able to play, thankfully, for a good number of games of this season, where he was only playing in, I think, 7 or 8 games this season, still putting up 41 receptions, almost 700 yards, 7 touchdowns, a 17.0 yards per catch ratio. And he was really he was exactly the number one for UNC the entirety of the time that he played. But like we go back to, there's some serious lacks in the profile. A lot of people are trying to put him up into this round 1, top of round 2 range and in the NFL draft, and I just don't really see that coming to fruition anymore. I think it was Daniel Jeremiah who put him in the first round of one of these drafts, and everybody started losing their minds of it was actually going to be a possibility that Tez Walker was going to be a player who could profile to be like that. And I still think there's some serious gaps here. But what he does possess is he possesses really high speed, a good frame at 6'1", 200 pounds. He's able to use his body to shield off defenders, but this contested catch thing is going to hold him back. We saw it apparently the entirety of the week. I wasn't there at the Senior Bowl, but everybody was saying he was having trouble catching the ball. Then we go to the actual Senior Bowl game, still having trouble catching the ball. I think he had 4 or 5 drops, all contested catches, but you can't have that many drops during the game. And especially where I actually have the trouble with it is whenever you go back and you watch the film of the 2023 UNC team, you go back and you see that Drake May is pretty damn good. And he is hitting Tez Walker in stride every single time. It's not like he has 5 yards of separation like a lot of these guys that we watch here. He really only has about 1 yard of separation, and Drake May is just laying in dime after dime after dime and just hitting him in stride to where he can keep up his highly athletic speed profile, just take the ball and take it to the house. I don't know. I don't think that's going to happen because I don't think he's a good enough route runner. I don't think he has elite athleticism that's going to translate to the NFL, at least on the field. It might show up at the combine, but I don't think he's as good of an athlete as the Troy Franklin, Brian Thomas is that I think he's going to be compared to a little bit as a deep threat. I don't think that that's really there. And so it's pretty hard for me to put Tez Walker any higher than I have him here at 10. And I think that's going to wrap up our top 10. We're going to get so much more into the nuances of all these wide receivers over the next couple of months before we get to the draft and even after the NFL draft in the fantasy draft room. But I do want to give a couple of honorable mentions because I'm sure there's a couple of guys that y'all are begging for me to put inside the top 10 that are currently not there. One of those is Senior Bowl standout Roman Wilson. I do think that he's a very good underneath short intermediate area wide receiver that can create a ton of separation. Had an absolutely fantastic Senior Bowl, will be a riser up the boards. I don't have enough on him yet to put him into my top 10. I do think that there's some overall athletic availabilities that are going to hold him back from getting into that point, but a player that is definitely worth putting on your radar in the 2024 wide receiver rankings that could eventually, I mean, if he does actually get the draft capital, he could end up being easily within this top 10 because he is always open for Michigan. But that Michigan offense runs a little bit weird. Still gives me a little bit of concern, but he is right there out on the outside looking in of my top 10 wide receivers at like 11 or 12. And then the big one that I think that everybody's going to give me a lot of grief over is Keon Coleman. I think a lot of people will probably have Keon Coleman as a top 6 wide receiver in this class. Transfer out of Michigan State over to Florida State and just absolutely demolished in the first game against LSU. Took 3 plays all the way to the house. I think he had almost like a 250-yard game, like 10 catches. It was an absolute monster of a game. One of the best games of tape that I've ever watched for a wide receiver in this class out of all of them that I've watched, and then didn't do anything the rest of the year. There's nothing else from this year from Keon Coleman that I'm honestly excited about. There was the one game against Florida State, and otherwise, all that he is a big body, contested catch wide receiver at 6'4", 210 pounds, and he uses his physicality to outduel cornerbacks who are a lot smaller than him at the college level, who are not as good as him. And that's perfectly fine. But actually using any of it, he doesn't create separation. He doesn't even win most of the time on his contested catch routes. There's a lot that I'd need to see out of Keon Coleman that I really wanted to see. Like the NFL Stock Exchange guys, I think, said on one of their podcasts, we really wanted him to be like the next Drake London whenever you put on the film. And then I look at the film and it's just not there. It doesn't follow up for me. So Keon Coleman, I know it probably is a surprise to a lot of people out there, not inside of my top 10. He's not even my 11 or 12. I think he's currently listed as my 13. And I still have a couple of other guys to watch, like Brendan Rice, son of Jerry Rice, who really performed well in the Senior Bowl. Malachi Corley could even go in there above him. And I think that legitimately by the end of this process, it won't be after the NFL draft capital comes in, right? Because NFL draft capital, I still think Keon Coleman will be taken very highly because he does possess all of that athletic availability, all of the athletic ability. But I don't think it transfers to the field. He won't be inside of my top 10 almost ever unless he does go really highly to a really good spot in the NFL draft. It's going to take a lot for me to really buy in on Keon Coleman, but I'm going to rewatch. I'm going to go back to that Michigan State tape as well in 2022, see if we see anything differently. But hope you enjoyed the top 10 overall wide receiver breakdown that we just put out here. We will get Chase on here soon to break down his top 10 wide receivers as well for sure. And I want to know what you all think. Drop it down in the comments below. Like, subscribe to the video. And thank you so much for joining me here in the Fantasy Draft Room.